Hi Theory 2 students. Today as I'm taping is Wednesday, April 22nd, 2020, and we have just completed a big unit test, and there are not too many weeks left in the semester at this point. So what I've decided to do is teach you one more concept, and then that is going to be it, and then the last week of classes, and as we get closer to final exams, we'll be able to review for the final exam, which will be your last thing for the semester, for the course. So today I'd like to talk to you about chromaticism a little bit and secondary dominance. We are going to be talking today about your first batch of chords that contain accidentals, may contain an accidental or more. These are called chromatic chords, and we'll just start this topic, and then we'll have to take up this topic again at the beginning of the fall semester in fall 2020. On the board I have four important terms that I'm going to go through and discuss. The first one at the top of the board there is chromaticism. And what I mean by chromaticism, and when I say the term chromaticism, when musicians talk about that term, we are referring to the use of pitches in a musical passage that do not belong to the key of the passage. Okay? So chromaticism refers to pitches that are foreign or that do not belong to the key of a passage or to the key of the music. Okay? Any kind of pitch that's foreign or doesn't fit would be an example of a chromatic pitch in music. So for instance, we can come up with a really simple example. If we are in the key of C, we know, for example, that the pitch F sharp does not belong in the key of C. But if we saw an F sharp used in a passage of music that was in the key of C, that F sharp we would regard and it would alert ourselves to the fact that it is a chromatic pitch. Chromaticism is the opposite of diatonicism. Diatonicism refers to notes that belong and fit naturally, exactly right in the key that you're working in. Chromatic pitches then are the opposite of that. They are pitches that are outside of the key that you're working in. They do not belong or fit normally in a particular key. Okay, so that's a little bit about chromaticism. Now, when a chord contains one or more chromatic pitches, we call the chord a chromatic chord. And that is the next term that I have here on the board. So a chromatic chord is any chord with or contains one or more accidentals. In other words, if you have a chord in music that has a chromatic pitch in the chord, a note that doesn't belong to the key you are in, then we would call that chord automatically a chromatic chord. Another term for a chromatic chord in music is this fancy term altered chord. I don't really use this term all that much in my classes. I use the term chromatic chord much more frequently, but it is helpful for you to know, especially with reading in your text, that an altered chord is the same thing. It means the same thing for us as a chromatic chord. It is a chord with at least one chromatic pitch. It could be a chord with more than one chromatic pitch in it, but there has to be a minimum of one for a chromatic chord to exist. Now, an example of a chromatic chord. Well, I didn't leave a lot of space on the board here, but, well, I could actually go to another screen where I do have more space. For instance, if I was in the key of C major, and I had this chord showing up, or I encountered this chord in C major, you can see that is a D major triad, and one of the pitches in the D major triad is a chromatic pitch, namely the F sharp. F sharp does not belong in C major. And so this would be an example of a chromatic or an altered chord, because it contains one chromatic pitch. And right now, we do not have a way to analyze a chromatic chord in a particular key, because we don't know how to make sense necessarily so far of why is this chromatic pitch, in this case the F sharp, what is that even doing in a passage of music that's in the key of C. By the end of this lecture, I am hoping and trusting that you will be able to understand a little bit about why chromatic pitches occur in music, and also we'll have a way or a method to analyze chromatic chords in music. At this point, all I will tell you is that you might think that because the root of this chord is D, that the analysis for this chord would be some kind of 2 chord, but that is not the case. In other words, we will not be using the capital 2 for a major triad built on scale degree 2. That is not going to be the case. We're going to call the chord or analyze it as something completely different. And just be patient as we go through the lecture, and we'll get to that. The most commonly encountered chromatic chord in tonal music is called a secondary chord. A secondary chord. And another term for a secondary chord is the term applied chord. I will define a secondary chord in just a moment, but I want you to get used to this terminology. Again, I do not use the term applied chord all that often in my teaching, even though the author may in your text. I use the term secondary chord much more frequently. Again, all secondary chords are chromatic chords. Okay? So if you're dealing with a secondary chord, then you know that it is a chromatic chord, and that means it contains at least one chromatic pitch. And for now, I'd like to tell you that secondary chords occur in all types of music, all types and styles of music. For instance, secondary chords occur in classical music, they occur in pop music, they occur in Broadway music, they occur in choir music, they occur in band music and jazz music, and all types of music. You can be guaranteed somewhere to be able to find a secondary chord. And so that's why they are very important. And we need to learn what they are, we need to learn how to analyze them, and we need to learn how to spell them. We need to learn how to spell them, because they're just found all over in music. Alright, now, let me see if I can define a secondary chord for you. A secondary chord is a chord with dominant function that applies its dominant function to a chord other than the tonic. So just to put a few main or important points about the definition of a secondary chord down here, we do need to know that a secondary chord always has to have or possess dominant function, first of all. Now, earlier in the semester, we talked about the types of chords that do possess dominant function. And let me list some of them here. Obviously, a 5 chord, a capital or major 5 triad has dominant function. A major minor 7th chord, the 5-7, that has dominant function. We also know from earlier in the semester that a leading tone triad possesses dominant function, albeit weaker dominant function than the 5 or the 5-7, but still dominant function. And then we also know that the 7-7 chords that we have learned recently, they also possess dominant function. Okay. So a secondary chord is always going to be a 5 or a 5-7 or a 7 triad or a 7-7 chord, because those chords possess dominant function. Now, the other part of the definition for a secondary chord is that not only does it have to be a chord with dominant function, it applies its dominant function to a chord other than tonic. Okay? So let me see if I can squeeze that in here. Maybe I'll use a different color. I'll write in here, this dominant function is applied to a chord that is not tonic, or a chord other than tonic. So, that's what you need to know about what a secondary chord is. It's a chord with a chromatic chord with dominant function, and that function is applied to a chord other than the tonic chord. Okay. Let me take a brief pause here. Again, feel free, if you need to rewind this video, go back and review any part of this video again. I would encourage it, I would recommend it, just because there is a lot of new information that I'm giving you today, since we are on a new topic. Now, before I define secondary dominant, let's go to another screen for right now. Maybe I can go to this screen. Yeah. Let's talk about normal dominant to tonic motion, or dominant to tonic relationships. We're very used to 5 going to 1, or maybe 5-7 going to 1. And I have a very brief example here in the key of C with a 5 chord, GBD, moving to a 1 chord, CEG. Now, don't worry, I'm not part writing this progression in 4 voices. These are just your basic block chords, basic block triads. Okay? Well, that's what a dominant chord does. Its root falls a 5th to the root of the tonic chord. So, as we know from earlier in the semester and from last semester, the root of a 5 chord, 5s like to go to 1. And when that happens, the root of a 5 chord falls a 5th, the interval of a 5th. It comes down a 5th to get to the root of the 1 chord, which will be the tonic note of the key. That's normal standard procedure, and we're very used to that. Well, when we talk about secondary chords, just as the root of a regular dominant falls a 5th to the root of the tonic chord, chords that act like 5 or 5-7 in their spelling and their resolution, but resolve to a scale degree and a harmony other than the tonic, these types of secondary chords are called specifically secondary dominants. Secondary dominants. And I'll go ahead and write that term on this screen as well, because I have a few examples of secondary dominants here. Okay? A secondary dominant is a chromatic chord that acts like a 5 or a 5-7 chord. It acts like a 5 or 5-7 chord in its spelling and its resolution, but it resolves to a scale degree and a chord other than the tonic. That's the definition of a secondary dominant. And let's see if we can use these few examples here to illustrate that point. You can see, for instance, even though in this middle measure I am in the key of C major, and I have a regular 2 chord over here, DFA, we would have no problem analyzing that DFA chord in C major as a minor 2. But what I have coming before this minor 2 chord is this 2 chord's own dominant chord. In other words, if I was not in the key of C major and I was in the key of D minor, I could analyze these 2 chords as 5 in D minor going to 1 in D minor. And you see how the root of this chord here falls a fifth to the root of this chord here. Again, if I was in D minor, the root of this chord would fall a fifth to get to the tonic of this chord. But see, the whole thing about secondary chords, and especially secondary dominants, is that we have this dominant to tonic relationship, but it's occurring not in the key you would expect. It's occurring in a different key. Okay? So what we have to do is we kind of have to think of this as, yes, I can analyze this chord in C major as a 2, but I can't make sense of this chord that contains a C sharp when I'm in the key of C. The only way I can make sense of this chord is to say that this chord is acting as a dominant to this chord, which is not tonic. And the way that we analyze secondary dominants, instead of using what I might expect, you might expect me to use, I'll use a capital Roman numeral 6, because this is an A major triad and it's built on A, which is the 6th scale degree of C major. No, that's not what we do, even though you might think that. What we do is we label this chord according to its function or behavior. Why is this chord actually here? It's emphasizing, or it's kind of making this chord that follows it sound a little more special because it is the dominant of that chord. And so we're going to analyze this type of chromatic chord, this secondary dominant, like this. We're going to use the symbol 5/2. And that is read as this chord is a 5 of a 2 chord in C major. Once again, because it's got a chromatic pitch and because it's a dominant and acting like a dominant to the chord that follows, we're calling the chord that follows as it stands normally in the key of C a 2, which it is, but we're referring to and analyzing the chord that comes before it as a dominant of a 2 chord in C major. And this is the symbol again that we use. We use 5/2. And the slash is read as the word of. A 5 chord of a 2 chord in the key of C major. So we can safely say that this A major triad in this measure, even though it's in the key of C, we can say that it is a secondary dominant of the chord that follows, that is the 2 chord. It's not a primary dominant. Primary dominants are just analyzed as 5 or 5/7, and they go to 1, the actual tonic. But secondary dominants are dominants of chords other than the tonic chord. So this is an example of a secondary dominant. In the next measure, I also have an example of a secondary dominant. In the key of C major still, you can see that I have a D major triad followed by a G major triad. Well, the G major triad is not difficult to analyze in the key of C major. We know that a G major chord in the key of C is just analyzed as a 5. A primary, a normal, a regular 5. However, when I have a G major chord preceded by D major, in other words, D major is G major's dominant. Right? If you think of, just pretend just for a moment that you were in G major. Is not D major the 5 chord in G major? Yes, it is. But we're not in G major. So we have to analyze the G chord as 5. And we can make sense of this chromatic chord by saying it is the dominant of the true 5 chord in the key of C. And so the analysis symbol for this chord would be a 5 / of the real 5, the normal true 5. This is the dominant of this, and just like any dominant chord does, its root falls a fifth to produce the next chord's root. Now, we know that in music, standard tonic chords are either major chords or minor chords. In other words, we never have a 1 Roman numeral or a 1 chord that would be augmented or diminished. It just doesn't happen. Only major and minor triads are stable enough to produce the sound of resolution, coming from somewhere and then landing at home base, so to speak, a major triad or a minor triad. Those types of triads are the only two that have the, again, stability to be a point of rest. Well, if tonic triads are always major or minor, it makes sense then that only a major or a minor triad can be preceded by its own dominant. Again, in these two examples, you can see that I have a minor triad and I preceded it by its own dominant. And in this example, I have a major triad and I preceded it by its own dominant. Because minor and major triads can only sound like, resolution, they only sound like a point of repose. Only major and minor triads can be preceded by their own dominant, which is a secondary dominant. Okay. That means that you would never ever have a secondary dominant that looks like this, 5 of 7 diminished. There's no way, because the 7 diminished chord cannot even sound, just for a brief moment, like a tonic chord or a point of repose. Only major and minor triads can. Okay, now, when a major or a minor triad is preceded by its own dominant, the non-tonic chord, just for a moment, it sounds like a tonic, even though it is not actually the tonic chord in the key. Let me say that again. When a major or minor triad is preceded by its own dominant, this non-tonic chord, the major or minor triad, it sounds for a brief moment like a tonic, even though it isn't actually a tonic. And the reason it sounds kind of more important, or kind of sounds like it's a tonic just briefly, is because a major triad or a major minor 7th chord is moving to a chord whose root is a fifth lower. And when we hear that motion, when we hear a major triad or a major minor 7th chord, both have dominant function, when we hear that fall, the root of that chord fall a fifth to the root of another chord that is major or minor, that sounds to our ears like dominant going to tonic, because we hear it so often. We hear it so many times. It's just that this procedure, this process, and this sound can happen with a chord that is not tonic. Okay, that's important to remember. We're actually kind of, if you want to think of it as on a slightly different level, it's just we're taking a chord that's not tonic and we're preceding it with its dominant to kind of make that chord, just for that beat or however long that chord lasts, make that chord sound like tonic temporarily, even though it's really not the true tonic in the key in which it's found. Okay, this process of making a chord that is not tonic briefly sound like tonic is called tonicization. I know it's a long word, but it's an important word. Tonicization. We say that when a major or minor triad is preceded by its own dominant, that secondary dominant chord tonicizes the chord that follows it. In other words, it makes that chord temporarily sound more important. It emphasizes or elevates its status because of the falling fifth root movement that we have. Okay? That's tonicization. And when tonicization occurs, the key of the passage does not change. That's a big point about this lecture too. We are not talking about key change at all. We are staying in one and the same key throughout, but we are using a non-tonic chord's own dominant, which will require an accidental. We are using that relationship within one key, and therefore the key does not change, and we say that a regular non-tonic chord is tonicized when it is preceded by its own dominant. The tonicization process usually involves just two chords, that is the secondary dominant itself and the chord that it is tonicizing. So for just that brief moment, that measure, or those few beats where those two chords are, we have a little tonicization, but we do not go into a different key. We stay in the same key throughout, and usually after we tonicize a chord, we get regular diatonic chords in normal progressions following that point in the original key. Okay, now I may have alluded to this a little bit, but let me go ahead and talk about the chromaticism part in detail. If we precede a chord that isn't tonic with its 5 or 5/7, this is where the chromaticism comes in. Okay. Since 5 chords are always major triads, and since 5/7 chords are always major minor 7th chords, it makes sense then that the dominant of a chord other than the tonic will contain notes that do not belong to the governing or prevailing key. It makes sense, right? Because if you're going to produce and spell a real dominant, a major triad or major minor 7th of a chord that's not tonic, well, chances are you're going to have to use some accidentals, or at least a pitch that belongs to this chord's key, so to speak, rather than just staying with all the notes and restricting yourselves to the notes of the prevailing key. Well, this is indeed the case. When we spell secondary dominants, we generally have to use at least one accidental, sometimes more accidentals, to make the secondary dominant indeed a major triad or a major minor 7th chord, so that it has dominant function and it can be a dominant to a chord that's not tonic. Okay, so maybe you can look at it this way. What I'm saying is that secondary dominants must always be spelled in the key of the non-tonic chord they are tonicizing. Okay? So in order to spell a dominant to a D minor triad, for instance, I need to kind of think maybe how would the dominant in the key of D minor be spelled? And that would be A, C sharp, E. That makes me a major triad. But the thing is, and maybe this is hard to understand when we initially talk about secondary dominants, is that this dominant that we just spelled is not used in the key we would expect. It's not used in the D minor key in this case. It's actually never used in the key of the chord it's tonicizing. Secondary dominants are always used in a key to which they do not belong. It's like we are kind of inserting something, injecting and inserting a chord that doesn't belong in the key of the prevailing key, but we're using it to give a little color and a little emphasis to the chord that follows it. And the chord that follows it does belong in the key that we are dealing with. Okay? So since the secondary dominant never really belongs in the key that it's being used in, we have to use accidentals. We have to use pitches that do not belong or fit in the key to make the secondary dominant always a major triad or a major minor 7th chord. Okay? Now, since secondary dominants do not belong to the key in which they're used, I do want to make a big point of this, and I know I've said it, but accidentals must be added to these secondary dominants to make them major triads or major seventh chords. And when you use an accidental, at least one, to spell a chord, you have spelled a chromatic chord. That goes back to the beginning of this lecture. That's why we're talking about chromatic chords. Again, secondary dominants are never used in a key to which they belong. Their secondary dominants are always spelled in relationship to the chord that follows them. Uses the notes of the key that the chord that follows them would be in, pretending this was one. And then, again, I don't know if that really makes sense, but then again, we're not really in the key of this chord right here. We're in another key, and so we just basically have to make this chord a major or a major triad or a major minor seventh chord to make it a dominant sound and have dominant function to a chord that is not tonic. Okay, there are only a few secondary dominants in all of music that do not require accidentals. They are rare. I mean, I could count them on one hand. There's so few of them. So we're not going to really worry about that for right now. What I do want you to know is that I'd say 97% of all secondary dominants require at least one accidental. And we're not necessarily used to adding accidentals to our chords unless we're spelling like a major 5 in a minor key. But this is something we're going to have to start getting used to. Secondary dominants are chromatic chords, and as such we're going to have to find at least one pitch, sometimes more than one pitch, will require an accidental so that they can be major triads always or major minor seventh chords always. Let's look at an actual passage of music now to see and hear how this all works. So on the screen I have a little bit of the opening of Puff the Magic Dragon. And I've just found a simple rendition or a simple notation of the beginning of this tune online because I think it will serve our purposes pretty well. Rather than using Roman numerals, we have popular chord symbols above each of the measures where we have chord changes. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and play this example at the piano, and notice that we're in the key of C major here. No flats, no sharps, and the first chord is C major. But by the time we get to the third line, we see a chord that's called D7. And a D7 chord, if you, again, remember your pop chord symbols, is actually a chord that's spelled D, F sharp, A, and C. And again, F sharp does not belong, normally fit in the key of C. So why is this D7 chord here? Why did the composer use that chord? Well, let's listen to it first, and then I'll see if I can talk you through it just a little bit. Okay, so we have say that there is a half cadence in the key of C in this measure right here with the G chord. Okay. We know that a G chord is a normal 5 in the key of C. Now, I want you to see how this secondary dominant works in the progression. This D7 chord is a secondary chord. It is a chromatic chord because it contains an F sharp. To spell it correctly, and F sharp doesn't belong in the key of C. Now, how do we analyze this chord if we were analyzing these with using Roman numerals? Well, you might be tempted to come along here and analyze this C chord as a capital 1 and the A minor chord as a lowercase 6. That's normal. And then you might be thinking, well, D is the root of this chord, So I need to label it as a 2 chord of some kind, maybe a 2-7. But a 2-7 in major keys, those are typically minor 7th chords. That's what they are. And this is not a minor 7th chord. This is a major minor 7th chord that would have an F sharp in the harmony. So we can't analyze this as a 2-7, like a big or capital 2-7. That doesn't reflect the chord's function or behavior in the progression. Rather, what we can do is we can look ahead in the music and see, oh, this chromatic chord, D7, is moving to a G chord. Well, think about that. If we were in the key of G, isn't D7 the 5-7 of G? Yes, D7 is the dominant 7th of G. But we're not in the key of G. So, we can't analyze this as just 5-7 to 1 in the key of G. In fact, if we looked at the music that follows, we go back to C major right away and we have another part of the verse. So we haven't changed key. We're still in C major. So the only way we can analyze this chromatic chord is to say that it is a 5-7 of the chord that follows it. Okay? So let me go ahead and write this in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to label the G, I'm going to analyze it as a normal Roman numeral 5 in the key of C. But this one I'm going to analyze as 5-7 of the normal 5 in the key of C. And I don't have a lot of room here, but I think what I'll do is I'll just put it right here. I'll say that this is a 5-7/5. That's read as, that chromatic chord is really a dominant 7th of the true 5 chord, which is right there. And this would be the correct Roman numeral analysis of these two harmonies in the key of C major. Just think about what the sound of a secondary dominant does to a progression. If I were to play this measure not with a D major minor 7th chord, but with a normal 2-7, like a D minor 7th chord, it just wouldn't sound the same. Let's see if I could pick it up right here at the beginning of this line on the piano. It just doesn't have the same impact, does it? If I play this with a diatonic chord, like a regular 2-7 or a minor minor 7th. Let me play these three measures one more time, back with the secondary dominant, and hopefully you can hear how much more important and how much more refreshing it is to have a chromatic pitch in the mix. So I'm going to move on to the last part of this lecture, and hopefully I can get through it before my time runs out. I'm going to show you there are 3 steps that you can follow in order to spell a secondary dominant correctly. You can always follow 3 steps to spell a secondary dominant correctly. And then I'm also going to try to explain to you, if I have time, how to analyze or recognize or verify that a chromatic chord that you might encounter would indeed be a secondary dominant. Now on page 258 of your textbook, this is a very important page. The 3 steps for spelling any secondary dominant correctly are listed right there, and you can just follow them in order. Let's go through an example right now. I'll maybe even use the example that's in the book on page 258. So let's say we are in the key of E flat major, and we need to spell a secondary dominant, such as this one, a 5 of a 6 chord. The way that we that I read this symbol, the 5 of 6, that secondary analysis symbol, is I find the root of the chord to the right of the slash first. This chord is the chord that would fit normally and behave normally and fit in E flat without any trouble. So what is the root of a 6 chord? That's the chord to the right of the slash in the key of E flat major. And I hope you're thinking the root of this chord would be C. A 6 chord in E flat major, again this chord belongs to the key, would be C. Well then, what we need to do is we need to find the root of C's dominant. In other words, we need to spell a dominant chord of a C chord. And the best way, I think, to find the root of this chord is to go up a perfect fifth from here. Because if I go up a perfect fifth from C, then I get the note G, and G really is the root of a dominant chord to C. So I'm going to write the root of my chord that I'm actually going to spell. And, I'm actually spelling this chord here, not this one. I'm spelling this one. So I write the root right here, and I know I need to spell a G major triad. Right? Because my 5 is uppercase, it's capital. Okay? So let's go ahead and do that. G would be the root, B and D. Now you might think, oh, that's pretty easy. Look, I've got GBD, that's a major triad. But be careful, we're in the key of E flat. And notice that the key signature makes our B that we put up here a B flat. So we need to add our accidental. This must be a major triad, not a minor triad. And so that is my final answer. G, B with a natural, and D. Because my 5 chords and my 5/7 chords, my secondary dominants, must be major triads or major minor 7th chords. Okay. Let's do maybe one more example of this. Let's go to a different clef and a different key. Let's say we're in the bass clef and we're in the key of F sharp minor. And you are asked to spell a 5/6 of a 4. Oh yes, by the way, secondary dominants and secondary 5/7s, they can be inverted. Yeah, absolutely. Alright, well let's go through the 3-step process once more. First of all, find the root of the chord that is being tonicized. That is the root of the chord to the right of the slash. And in F sharp minor, that root is B. Now, what is B's, the note B's dominant? Go up a perfect fifth from B and we'll get B's dominant pitch. Up a perfect fifth from B is F sharp, so that is going to be the root of my secondary dominant that I'm trying to spell. Now, before I put it in inversion, let's see how to spell a major triad on F sharp in root position. So I'd have to have F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. That's a major triad built on the correct root we calculated, F sharp. Now, putting it in first inversion, that means the A sharp must be on the bottom. So if you did this, you would be very close to your final answer, but it wouldn't be quite correct. Remember, this is a major triad, and it's a dominant chord of something that's not tonic. So I need to add my accidental here, the sharp on the A, so that it is indeed what I've calculated, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, in first inversion. Those accidentals, don't forget them. These are our first steps into chromatic chords. Okay. The last thing I'd like to talk about is how to verify. Like if you see a chromatic chord in a passage of music, if you see a chord with an accidental, one or more accidentals in it, how do you know for sure, could it be or is it a secondary dominant? And these are the 3 steps that you want to take when you come across a chromatic chord. Let me go ahead and choose an example. Maybe I'll do this one in the key of G major. And I have this chromatic chord. It's an E, G sharp B in first inversion. Now at first you might think, oh, I don't know how to do this. I mean, what on earth is a G sharp doing in a chord that's in the key of G? Well, we now have ways to analyze this and deal with this. The chances are that this is going to be a secondary dominant. It just has to pass 3 conditions before we can actually call it a secondary dominant. The first condition is the altered or the chromatic chord here, is it a major triad or a major minor 7th chord? If it is not, then it would not be a secondary dominant, and you could put an X in the blank for your homework. But this happens to be a major triad. It is. So that means it has the potential, or it could be, a secondary dominant to some non-tonic chord in the key of G. So, if this was a secondary dominant, what chord would it be a secondary dominant of? Or what chord would it be a dominant of? Well, in this case, we find the root of this chord, and notice the root is here. The root is E, because it's an E, G sharp B chord. And we go down a perfect fifth. Because we're saying if E is the root of a dominant to something, then that something's root would be a perfect fifth lower than the root of this chord. So, the root of fifth, or the note a perfect fifth below E is A. That's the second condition. Now, the third condition is, would a major or a minor triad built on A be diatonic, or would that triad fit normally in the key of G? So we're saying, remember, because secondary dominants can only tonicize chords that are major or minor, not diminished or augmented. And so we're supposing if I had a major triad on A, would that chord fit nice and neatly in G? No, it wouldn't. But if I had a minor triad on A, would that chord fit nice and neatly in G major? The answer is yes. What Roman numeral would we give an A minor triad in G major? We would give it the Roman numeral 2. And so because this chromatic chord is a major triad, and its root is a fifth above an A, and a minor triad on A would be a 2 chord in G, what we're saying is that yes, this is a secondary dominant, and it's going to be called a 5 of a 2. It's the dominant, this E major triad is the dominant of an A minor triad, which is 2 in the key of G. And the only other thing I still need to do to make this analysis symbol correct is that notice my secondary dominant is not in root position. It's in first inversion. So I have to put a little 6 to the left of my slash so that the secondary dominant is indeed a 5-6, or first inversion dominant of a 2. Let's go ahead, and I don't know, I may have time for just one more. Let's do one of these on I have a separate screen here. So I'm going to be in the bass clef, and I'm in the key of B flat major. And I want us to, I'm looking at the wrong one. Let's do another one. Bass clef in the key of, how about C sharp minor? C sharp minor. Okay. And I'm given this chromatic chord. F sharp A and D natural, because I'm in the bass clef. Okay. The question is, could this be a secondary dominant of something in the key of C sharp minor? Well, let's go through the 3 steps. Number 1, is the chord we're looking at a major triad or a major minor 7th chord? The answer is yes, it is a major triad. It's D, F sharp, A. Okay. Now, the next step would be to ask or tell ourselves that what we need to do is we would need to find the note that's a perfect fifth below the root of this chromatic chord. Because again, if we're saying that this could potentially be a secondary dominant, that means it would be a dominant of a chord whose root is a fifth lower than the root of this chord. And the root of this chord is D. The note a perfect fifth lower than a D is a G. Specifically G natural, not a G sharp. So, the third and final step is to ask yourself, would a major or a minor triad built on G natural be diatonic or fit into this key of C sharp minor? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. Because G natural has nothing to do with C sharp minor. And even if I spelled a major or a minor triad on G natural, the chord still wouldn't belong in C sharp minor. So you might think, well, can't you call this a 5/6 of a maybe a 5? No, you can't, because this note, the root of this chord, is the dominant of G natural, and G natural cannot serve as a part of any diatonic chord in C sharp minor. So what we do for an example like this is we say that this chromatic chord could not be a secondary dominant in the key of C sharp minor, and we can just put an X in the blank because it doesn't satisfy the 3 steps on the bottom of 258 and 259. I want you to refer to these steps as you do your next homework assignment. It's very, very crucial. It's very, very helpful. So, with that said, I want you to remember that you cannot ever have a secondary dominant of a diminished chord. You will never have that happen. If in this process you come up with a chord that would be a diminished triad in the governing key, then you'd still put an X in the blank, because secondary dominants can only tonicize major and minor chords. And the other thing I want to mention is that secondary dominants can be in any inversion. Like for instance, we could have a 5/4-2 of a 3 chord, for instance, in a particular key. The only inversion that secondary dominants will never be in is the second inversion of a triad. You will never see, for instance, a 5/6-4 of something. We talked about 6/4 chords at length last unit, okay? And we know that they are used specially. So, the next homework assignment that I'm going to put up on Canvas is going to be workbook pages 133A and workbook pages 134B. And you can do every problem there on those 2 pages. Be aware that on page 133, key signatures are required, but you do not need to follow the instructions about putting in lead sheet symbols. You can ignore lead sheet symbols completely. We're not going to use pop symbols. But do put a key signature in for every problem first on page 133. 134, the directions should be pretty straightforward. I will go ahead and again put all this information on Canvas in detail for you, give you a due date, and again, I know this lecture is kind of long, but there's a lot of information to start this new topic, and please re-watch some of this video, any part of this video that you may need to, again, for review as you do your homework. Otherwise, that's where I will stop for today. And have a good rest of your week.